Oh, hi, welcome. Last time we have talked on the law of demand and supply, and now we will start. We will talk lastly uh, on the possibility of shift in demand and supply and how it will change the equilibrium point when that kind of a shift basically occurs. Um, first. So this is a typical model when you basically have both demand and supply on the same graph. Demand downward slope, supply upward slope, and you have a you can see the equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity. These two um, these two variables together make up the equilibrium point, because by knowing the equilibrium price and quantity, you can find a definite point on the graph, which is the intersection point of demand and supply. So now, what will happen if demand increases? Let's say for example, in the corona crisis, um, demand, the people need more masks, so the demand for masks has increased. Um, this will actually, uh, well, this will actually make the equilibrium point move along the supply curve, and we will end up at a point with a higher price and higher equilibrium price and higher equilibrium quantity. So when demand increases, this will increase the price, equilibrium price, and the equilibrium quantity. Uh, well, will, for example, change in needs and wants increase the supply? No, because we assume demand and supply are independent from each other, and the effects that are influencing the demand are basically increasing quantity supplied through the price mechanism. But since supply is independent, is actually defined for each price level, basically, and since the increase in demand only affects the quantity supply through prices, basically, corona crisis, uh, just by increasing uh, the need for masks doesn't affect supply. So when need for masks increases, this will increase demand, and in the end we will end up at a higher equilibrium point and equilibrium quantity, which means quantity supplied will increase as price increases. Of course, the producers will produce more masks. However, this is because, well, the increase in demand ultimately forces the price to go up. Which means actually our supply is fixed, and we are moving along the supply curve. That's why the quantity supplied increases. I hope this point is clear. Um, well, may the corona crisis affect them? Affect the um, supply? It might. It may have affected supply. If it affects the factors that are affecting the supply itself. For example, if input prices for the masks has increased because maybe transportation lines have broken down, in that case, supply might decrease. In that case, supply curve will shift to the left, while demand curve may have shifted to the right. While the if the for example, need for masks lead to more research on mask production. As a result, the mass production becomes more efficient, and the technological advancement increase the efficiency of mass production. In that case, supply might increase. In that case, supply curve will shift right. We will see what will happen in those cases. The case here on this graph will show just what happens if the demand increases and supply remains constant. Well, so this is the case when supply increases or decreases. As I said, well, for example, when the oil prices in general increased, the demand for transportation will not directly affected from that, because it is affected by the need for transportation, or want for transportation, income level, and the prices of components or the substitutes. But supply will be affected in that case. If oil prices get cheaper, in that case, input prices for transportation will get smaller, production costs will decrease. As a result, supply will increase. When supply increases while demand remains constant, well, we will move along the demand curve down. As a result, we have a higher equilibrium quantity. Equilibrium quantity will increase. Equilibrium price will decrease in this case. When the opposite happens, for example, oil prices increase, in that case, if we are talking on the transportation market, well, the companies will supply less quantity of transportation at the same price level, which means supply decreases. In that case, we are moving along the demand curve, this time up. So in this case, the equilibrium quantity will decrease, equilibrium price will increase, basically. Similarly, if the demand decreases, I mean, here I haven't shown the opposite case, but if demand decreases, if we move from D2 to D1, in that case, both equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity will decrease. So, what will happen if the demand and supply increase or decrease together? For example, let's say while the demand for transportation, I don't know, or for example, let's say we are talking on the automobiles, and because the oil prices are higher, this increases the cost of production of car, which might basically decrease the supply. At the same time, because oil prices are higher, this will increase also gasoline prices, which will in the end also, because gasoline is a complement of the cars, this will decrease also the demand for the cars. Well, in that case, both D will shift and D will decrease, demand will decrease, and supply will decrease. If that's the case, you see the decrease in demand from D to D1 is basically we are moving along the supply curve down. Let's say this first decrease has happened. It will decrease the price and decrease the equilibrium price and decrease the equilibrium quantity. But when we move from S to S1, now we will move along to D1, because first the decrease in demand has happened. Now our new curves are D1 and S, and now S starts to shift to S1. So we will move along D1, and when we move along to D1, our equilibrium quantity will decrease further, but our equilibrium price will increase. So decrease in demand and supply will create opposite effects in terms of price. Decrease in demand will basically decrease the price, but decrease in supply will increase the price. So we cannot know the price effect. It depends on which change is dominant. If the change in demand is dominant, then the price will decrease. If change in supply is dominant, then the price will increase. If they are more or less the same, then the equilibrium price might remain more or less the same. And here I'm meaning equilibrium price. Well, I know for sure equilibrium quantity will decrease, since both decrease in supply and decrease in demand decrease equilibrium quantity. The opposite case is when the supply shifts from S1 to S and demand from D1 to D. In that case, equilibrium quantity will certainly increase. Again, the change in price is not known. We are calling, in that case, it is ambiguous. It can go in both directions, or it can even stay the same. Okay, so we are left only with one case, and that's the case when demand increases and supply decreases, or the opposite. Let's say, for example, in case of the masks case, because input prices are getting higher because of the transportation difficulties, world economy is slowing down, not that many workers are working. For example, it's difficult to find workers, and the costs are higher. So because in the workplace they need to work they need protection equipment, for example. In that case, demand will increase. Increase in demand, let's say first we have increase in the demand level. So while our demand increase from D to D, comma, we are moving from this point to this point. So our equilibrium quantity will increase, our equilibrium price will also increase. But now, let's say we are at the intersection of S and D, this D dot, and then our supply will decrease. Let's assume after this has happened, because again the labor costs have increased. In that case, we are moving on D, this curve, black curve, up, and as we move up, our equilibrium price will increase, our equilibrium quantity will decrease. So increase in demand will increase equilibrium quantity, decrease in supply will decrease equilibrium quantity. So change in equilibrium quantity is ambiguous, unknown. It can be positive, negative, or zero, depending on the relative strength, or which effect is dominant. Is the effect created by increase in demand is dominant, or is the effect created by decrease in supply is dominant? However, both increase in demand and decrease in supply will increase the equilibrium price, so equilibrium price will certainly go up. In the opposite case, when supply increase and demand decrease, in that case the equilibrium price will certainly go down, while the equilibrium quantity, change in equilibrium quantity, will be again ambiguous. It will depend on the fact which effect is more dominant. Okay. I should write mask. Previously it was oil market. Now I have changed to the mask market, but I have forgotten to change the oils here. But anyway, we have already reviewed it. If we just take into account change in the demand through because of the change in the needs, then this could be the effect. I mean, demand increases, we move along the supply curve, so price will increase and quantity will also increase. But if you also take into account the fact that the labor costs are increasing because of the additional protection equipment from the so that the workers won't catch the coronavirus themselves, in that case we have an increase in demand. We are moving from D1 to D2, and I mean here this from the blue curve to black curve, but we have a decrease in supply. We move from the green curve to red curve, so we are moving from this equilibrium point to this equilibrium point. So the price of masks will certainly increase, but equilibrium price of masks will certainly increase. But what will happen to the equilibrium quantity of masks is not known. It will depend on the relative strength of the effects created by increase in demand and decrease in supply. If the effect created by increase in demand is dominant, then the equilibrium quantity of mask will increase, otherwise it will decrease. Or if the effects cancel each other or more or less the same, then the equilibrium quantity of the mask will remain more or less the same. So I will stop here. See you in the next part.